"Go softly," she begged, her voice a raw, torn whisper in the dark. "Please, it's my first time." The words hung in the air between them, a sacred confession. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic rhythm of fear and desperate want. The man above her, Jason, stilled completely. The hard, masculine planes of his body, a silhouette of pure power against the moonlit window, seemed to absorb her plea. His dark eyes, usually so unreadable, now held a storm of emotion, possession, tenderness, and a fierce, protective heat that seared her to her soul. In that suspended moment, as the weight of his gaze held her, Aria understood. This was not just a surrender of her body. It was the shattering of a life. It was the answer to every silent prayer she had ever choked back in the hollow, echoing halls of the monastery. It was the beginning, and it had started with an ending. The echo of silence. The bell for matins had not rung. That was the first wrong thing. For 15 years, Sister Aria's world had been measured in bells, the call to prayer, to meals, to silence, to sleep. But this morning, the ancient bell tower was mute. Instead, a different, more frantic sound echoed through the cold stone corridors. The sound of hushed, panicked voices. Aria knelt in the chapel, her fingers automatically tracing the worn beads of her rosary. Hail Mary, full of grace, but the words felt like ash in her mouth. Her focus was fractured, pulled to the uncomfortable tightness of her woolen habit across her chest. A constant, shameful reminder of the body she tried to pray away. She was late 20s, but in the monastery, time was a flat circle. She had entered as a gawky, curvy girl of 16, her body already betraying her with a womanly shape that felt like a sin. The sisters spoke of mortification of the flesh, of turning away from worldly desires. Aria had tried. God, how she had tried. But her flesh was a persistent traitor. The swell of her hips, the fullness of her breasts, they were a landscape of temptation she carried with her, a prison of her own making. The halls were filled with prayer, but her nights were filled with a different kind of introspection, a burning, nameless longing that left her sweating and ashamed in her narrow cot. Sister Aria, Mother Superior's voice, was like a shard of ice cutting through her thoughts. The older woman's face was a grim mask. The bishop is withdrawing his patronage. There is a financial scandal. The monastery must be temporarily closed. The world tilted. The solid stone floor beneath her knees seemed to liquefy. Closed. But where will we go? The other sisters have families. You, Mother Superior's gaze was not unkind, but it was brutally pragmatic. You came to us with nothing. You will have to find your way. The world will test your faith, child. See that it does not break you. An hour later, Aria stood at the heavy oak gates, a small, worn bag at her feet. She was no longer in her habit. She wore a simple, outdated dress donated years ago, the fabric straining painfully across her bust and hips, outlining a shape that felt obscenely visible. She felt naked, exposed, as if she had shed not just her robes, but her very skin. The gate closed behind her with a final, resonant thud that shook her to her bones. She was cast out. Alone. The vast, noisy, terrifying world stretched before her, and she had no map for its treacherous geography. The city was a sensory assault. The blare of car horns was a demonic chorus after the monastery's silence. The press of bodies on the sidewalk felt like a violation. Men's eyes, bold and appraising, lingered on the curves she tried to hide, making her skin crawl with a mixture of fear and a strange, flickering anger. She spent her meager savings on a week in a dingy hostel, the room smelling of stale cigarettes and despair. On the third day, lost and disoriented, she took a wrong turn into a dimly lit alley. Two men emerged from the shadows, their intentions clear in their leering smiles. "Well, hello there. A little lost lamb, are we?" Aria froze, her heart seizing. She clutched her cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. But no divine intervention came. Only the advancing men. "Leave her alone." The voice was not loud. It was low, a rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. It held an authority that was absolute. The men spun around. Aria's gaze followed theirs, and her breath caught. He stood at the mouth of the alley, backlit by the distant streetlights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in a dark suit that hugged a powerful, masculine frame. His skin was the color of rich espresso, and his face, it was all hard lines and fierce intelligence, with eyes that saw everything. He was in his mid-40s, and every one of those years seemed etched into his features as strength. "This ain't your business, man," one of the thugs snarled, though he took a step back. The man, Jason, didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes were fixed on Aria. They were the color of dark honey, and in that moment, they were the only calm thing in her whirling universe. "I said," Jason repeated, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "leave her alone." Something in his tone, in the sheer, contained power of his stance, made the decision for them. The two men muttered curses and slunk away. Aria stood trembling, her knees threatening to give way. Jason walked toward her, his steps measured and silent. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her face, her terrified eyes, the way her hands shook. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, the truth torn from her. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, seeing the nun's terror behind the woman's eyes. He saw the innocence, the displacement, and he saw the lush, ripe body that her cheap dress could not conceal. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a request. It was the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. Go with a stranger. A man who looked at her as if he could see the secret, yearning woman screaming inside the pious shell. But the gate to her old life was closed. The hostel was a dead end. And this man, he felt like the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. Swallowing the last of her fear, she nodded. Jason's home was not a home. It was a fortress of modern elegance. Floor to ceiling, windows showcased a glittering cityscape. The furniture was minimal, stark, and brutally expensive. It was a world of clean lines and silent spaces, a stark contrast to the ornate, crowded piety of the monastery. He gave her a room with an ensuite bathroom. "You're safe here," was all he said before leaving her alone. The first few days were a silent dance. He was often gone, a phantom presence in his own home. When he was there, his gaze was a constant, physical weight. He watched her, studied her as if she were a complex equation he was determined to solve. One evening, he found her staring out the window at the city lights. "You look at the world as if you've never seen it before," he observed, coming to stand beside her. "I haven't," she admitted softly. "Not this world." "What world did you come from, Aria?" he asked, his use of her name a deliberate, intimate shock. She told him. Haltingly, she spoke of the monastery, the bells, the silence. She did not speak of the longing. He listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, "They taught you your body was a sin." It wasn't a question. Heat flooded her cheeks. She looked down, wrapping her arms around herself. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. She forced her eyes to his. "They were wrong," he said, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "What you have is a gift. It's a crime to be ashamed of it." No one had ever spoken to her like that. It felt blasphemous. It felt liberating. The tension between them began to simmer. It was in the way his hand would brush against hers when he passed her a cup of tea. It was in the way her body reacted to his proximity, a traitorous heat pooling low in her belly. It was in the charged silence that fell between them, thick with unspoken things. One night, she was in the kitchen, getting a glass of water. She was wearing a simple cotton nightgown he had bought for her, and she knew it did little to hide her shape. She felt his presence before she saw him. She turned, and he was there, leaning against the doorway, watching her. His eyes were dark, hungry. They traveled over her, from her loose hair down to her bare feet, lingering on the swell of her hips, the curve of her breasts beneath the thin fabric. It wasn't the leering gaze of the men in the alley. This was different. This was appreciation. This was want. And it set her blood on fire. Her breath hitched. The glass of water trembled in her hand. He didn't move. He just watched the effect he had on her. A small, knowing curve at the corner of his mouth. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low caress. She could only shake her head. He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her, each step measured. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away. She could smell the clean, masculine scent of him, soap, and something uniquely him. It was dizzying. He reached out, and her entire body went rigid. But he didn't touch her skin. His fingers brushed against a stray lock of her hair, tucking it gently behind her ear. touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to her core. His knuckles grazed her cheek, a whisper of contact that burned. "Your skin is so soft," he murmured, his eyes holding hers captive. "I've wondered." Aria was drowning in his gaze, in his proximity. This was wrong. It had to be wrong, but it felt more right than any prayer she had ever uttered. He leaned in, his head dipping toward hers. This was it, the fall from grace. Her eyes fluttered shut, but the kiss never came. He pulled back, his breath warm against her lips. "When I kiss you, Aria," he whispered, the promise a dark, delicious threat, "you won't be trembling from fear. You'll be trembling from want." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the kitchen, her body aching, her faith in ruins, and her heart beating a frantic, eager rhythm for the devil who had promised her heaven. The days that followed were a sweet, agonizing torture. Jason's promise hung in the air between them, a constant, throbbing presence. He was a master of anticipation. His every look, every casual brush of his hand, a deliberate step in her unraveling. He began to orchestrate her transformation. He replaced her modest, ill-fitting dresses with clothes that were both elegant and unapologetically feminine. A silk blouse that whispered against her skin, its fabric draping in a way that hinted at the curves beneath. Trousers that hugged the swell of her hips before tapering down her legs. "Look," he commanded one evening, turning her to face a full-length mirror. Aria froze. The woman staring back was a stranger. The blouse was a deep emerald, a color she'd never have chosen, and it made her skin glow. It outlined the full, round shape of her breasts, the narrowness of her waist. The trousers celebrated the feminine curve of her hips she had spent a lifetime trying to negate. "I can't," she whispered, her instinct to cross her arms over her chest, to hide. His hands settled on her shoulders from behind, warm and heavy, holding her in place. His eyes met hers in the reflection. "You can. You are. This is who you are, Aria. A woman, not a ghost in a habit." Tears pricked her eyes. It wasn't shame she felt, but a profound, disorienting sense of recognition. This body, this woman, had been there all along, screaming to be let out. Her prayers at night changed. They were no longer pleas for deliverance from desire, but confused, chaotic whispers of gratitude and guilt. "Thank you for this silk. Forgive me for liking the way it feels." The lines between sin and salvation were blurring, and Jason was the architect of the beautiful, terrifying haze. One afternoon, he took her to an art museum. They stood before a classical sculpture of a goddess, her marble form lush and voluptuous, her body a testament to fertile, powerful womanhood. "They used to worship this," Jason said quietly, his voice resonating in the hushed gallery. "They saw the divine in this form, in curves like yours, strength and softness, life itself." His hand found the small of her back, a possessive, grounding touch. That's what they made you ashamed of, the very essence of life. The revelation was a seismic shift inside her. The foundation of her guilt, so carefully laid over 15 years, cracked. She wasn't sinful. She was powerful. She was a goddess in a cheap dress, and he was the first to see it. That night, the tension reached its breaking point. They were in his library, the scent of old books and his cologne, a heady mix. She was looking at a volume of poetry, feeling his gaze on her like a physical touch. When she looked up, he was there, closer than she'd expected. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice rough. The control he always wore like a second skin, finally fraying. He didn't wait for a reply. He cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "I've been patient. I've watched you blossom. Now I'm going to taste the flower." And then his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a conflagration. It was everything he had promised and more. His lips were firm, demanding, and she met his demand with a surge of her own, a dam of repressed desire breaking open. Her hands, of their own volition, fisted in the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. A low groan rumbled in his chest, and the sound vibrated through her, a primal music she instantly craved. This was not a sin. This was a baptism. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing raggedly. Her lips felt swollen, sensitized. The world had tilted on its axis and would never right itself. "Jason," she breathed, his name a prayer on her lips. A predatory smile touched his mouth. "That's only the beginning, little nun. The very beginning." He swept her into his arms, and she didn't protest. She buried her face in his neck, inhaling his scent, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a wild, thrilling anticipation. He carried her to his bedroom, a space of dark woods and deep colors, a temple to his masculinity. He laid her on the vast bed, following her down, caging her with his powerful arms. His eyes burned with a dark fire. "Tell me you want this," he commanded, his voice a husky whisper. "I will have your surrender, Aria, but I will have it given freely." She looked up at him, at this man who had seen the woman beneath the vows, and drawn her out with a mix of patience and raw dominance. All the prayers, the rules, the silence, it fell away, leaving only a profound, crystalline truth. "I want this," she whispered, her voice steady for the first time. "I want you." It was all the permission he needed. His mouth found hers again, but this kiss was different. Slower, deeper, a deliberate exploration that left her dizzy. His hands began their own journey, and she was content to be the map. He peeled the silk blouse from her shoulders, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of her back, making her arch against him. When the fabric fell away, barring her to the waist, he went still above her. His gaze was reverent, hot. "God, Aria," he breathed, the word a prayer in this new religion they were creating. "You are so beautiful." His large, dark hands that looked capable of such violence, were impossibly gentle as they traced the full, heavy curves of her breasts. His thumbs brushed over her tightening nipples, and a sharp, exquisite jolt of pleasure made her cry out. He lowered his head, and his mouth followed the path his hands had blazed. The sensation of his warm, wet tongue circling her peak was her undoing. She tangled her fingers in his hair, holding him to her, a low moan tearing from her throat. This was not the chaste, cold existence she had known. This was life, vibrant and searingly hot. He worshipped every inch of her with his hands and mouth, removing the rest of their clothes until there was nothing between them but skin and desperate need. He explored the dip of her waist, the dramatic sweep of her hips, the softness of her belly, murmuring his approval against her skin. So soft, everywhere, so perfect. She was burning up, a creature of pure sensation. The world had narrowed to this room, this bed, this man. The last vestiges of her old life, the ingrained voice that whispered sin, were drowned out by the roaring in her blood. When he settled between her thighs, the hard, hot length of him pressing against her most intimate place, a sudden, primal fear lanced through the haze of pleasure. This was it, the final barrier, the point of no return. He felt her tense. He stilled, his body rigid with the effort of his control. His eyes, dark with passion, searched hers. "Look at me," he said, his voice strained. She forced her eyes open, meeting his intense gaze. "I will never hurt you," he vowed, the words an oath. "I will take you apart, Aria, but I will put you back together, whole and new." She believed him. With every fiber of her being, she trusted this man. She nodded, a tiny, frantic movement. He began to push forward, slowly, inexorably. There was a sharp, tearing pain. A gasp caught in her throat, her nails digging into the hard muscles of his back. He stopped immediately, his whole body trembling. Aria. It was the pain of her old life breaking, the pain of being born. Through the sting, she felt the incredible, overwhelming fullness of him, the rightness of it. "Don't stop," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears and wonder. He groaned, a sound of pure, male triumph, and surged forward, burying himself completely inside her. They were joined. One. For a moment, they simply stayed like that, breathing each other's air, her body stretching to accommodate his. The initial pain was already receding, replaced by a deeper, more urgent ache. He began to move. A slow, deliberate rhythm that was both a claiming and a devotion. With each stroke, he whispered her name. With each thrust, he shattered another piece of her past. "Jason," she moaned, her head thrashing on the pillow. The sensations were building, coiling tight in her core, a storm about to break. She was losing herself, her mind fragmenting under the relentless, glorious assault. It was too much. It wasn't enough. He felt it too, the impending climax. His movements became more powerful, more primal. He drove into her, his control finally, completely shattered. "Come for me, Aria," he growled against her ear, his voice raw. "Let go," I've got you." The coil snapped. A scream was torn from her. A raw, uninhibited sound of pure ecstasy as her body convulsed around his. Waves of pleasure, so intense they were almost painful, crashed over her, dragging her under. She was dimly aware of his own guttural cry as he found his release, his body pulsing deep within hers, his name a broken prayer on her lips. For a long time, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing in the dark. He collapsed beside her, gathering her shaking body against his, her back to his chest. His arms wrapped around her, holding her as the aftershocks gently rocked her. He pressed a kiss to her sweat-dampened shoulder. "My Aria," he murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction and something else, something deeper. "Mine." Tears, not of sorrow or guilt, but of overwhelming, soul-deep relief, streamed down her face, soaking into the pillow. She had not been broken. She had been remade. The raging desires of her body were not a curse to be denied, but a gift to be celebrated. The pious nun was gone. In her place was a woman gloriously, passionately alive. She had finally come home. Dawn painted the room in shades of rose and gold. Aria awoke to the unfamiliar weight of an arm draped possessively over her waist, the solid warmth of a hard body pressed against her back. For a disorienting second, the ghost of the monastery's wake-up bell echoed in her mind. Then, the memories of the night flooded in, vivid and sensory. The scrape of his stubble against her inner thigh, the taste of his skin, the feeling of him moving inside her, filling a void she hadn't known existed. A faint, residual soreness pulsed between her legs, a physical testament to her transformation. It was not an unpleasant feeling. It was a brand, a reminder that she was now irrevocably his. She shifted slightly, and his arm tightened, pulling her closer. His voice, sleep-roughened, murmured against her hair, "Go back to sleep." The intimacy of it was more profound than the sex. This quiet, morning entanglement, this unspoken claim. She lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her spine. Her mind, usually a battleground of prayer and guilt, was silent, serene. The war was over. When she finally slipped out of bed, his dark eyes followed her, watching her naked form walk to the window. A week ago, she would have scrambled to cover herself, shame heating her cheeks. Now, she felt the weight of his gaze, and it felt like worship. She stood bathed in the morning light, her full curves gilded, and for the first time, she saw herself through his eyes, not as a collection of sinful temptations, but as a masterpiece of flesh and bone. He joined her at the window, his bare chest a wall of muscle, and scars she now knew the taste of. He didn't touch her, just stood beside her, a silent pillar of strength. "No prayers this morning?" he asked, his tone not mocking, but genuinely curious. Aria looked out at the waking city. "I feel like my entire life has been a prayer," she said softly. "And last night was the answer." He turned her to face him, his hands resting on the lush curve of her hips. The answer to what? To the longing, she whispered, her hands coming to rest on his chest. All those years, I thought I was longing for God, but I was just lonely. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. You'll never be lonely again. It was a vow. The bubble of their new life couldn't last. The outside world, with its judgments and consequences, was a patient hunter. It began with a phone call Jason took in his study. His voice, a low, controlled fury she could hear through the door. When he emerged, his face was a carefully neutral mask, but she saw the storm in his eyes. We need to go out, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took her to a discreet, high-end boutique, his mission clear: to armor her in the trappings of his world. He chose a dress of deep crimson cashmere that clung to every one of her curves like a lover's caress. It was elegant, expensive, and screamed of a woman who was cherished and desired. As they left the shop, a familiar, gaunt figure froze on the sidewalk, her plain gray coat a stark contrast to the vibrant luxury of the street. Mother Superior. The old woman's eyes widened, moving from Aria's radiant face to the possessive way Jason's hand rested on the small of her back, to the dress that left no doubt about the life she was now living. Her expression was not one of anger, but of profound, soul-sick disappointment. Sister Aria, she said, the title a lash. Aria's breath caught. Jason's hand tightened on her back, a silent signal of support. It is just Aria now, Mother, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I see, Mother Superior said, her gaze flicking to Jason with a mixture of fear and disdain. We heard whispers that you had fallen into the company of a worldly man. I prayed they were lies. Her eyes returned to Aria, brimming with a sorrow that felt like a physical blow. You have traded eternal grace for temporary flesh. You have broken your vows for this. The old shame tried to rise, a phantom limb of her former self. But then she felt Jason's solid presence beside her, an anchor in the sudden storm. She remembered the feeling of his worship, the rightness of her surrender. I haven't broken anything, Mother, Aria replied, her chin lifting. I've simply stopped pretending the flesh is separate from the soul. My grace feels anything but temporary. Mother Superior flinched as if struck. Without another word, she turned and walked away, a solitary figure of condemnation fading into the crowd. Aria trembled, the encounter draining her. Jason guided her into a waiting town car. Inside the quiet interior, he pulled her into his arms. Look at me, he commanded softly. She did. His eyes were fierce, proud. You are magnificent, he said, his thumb wiping a single tear she hadn't realized had fallen. My brave, beautiful woman. In that moment, any last shred of doubt vanished. She had chosen her path. She had chosen him, and she would walk it, no matter the scandal, no matter the cost. The scandal, as Jason had feared, broke with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. An anonymous source, undoubtedly connected to the diocese, had sold a story to a tabloid. The headline was brutal: "Saint or Sinner? Runaway nun shacks up with mysterious tycoon." Below it was a grainy, long-lens photo of them kissing on his balcony, her crimson dress a splash of damning color. Aria stared at the newspaper, her stomach churning. The article was a masterpiece of vilification, painting her as a wanton hypocrite and Jason as a predatory corrupter. It mentioned his shadowy past, his wealth, and heavily implied their relationship was a transgression against nature and God. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the paper crumpling in her hands. "I've dragged you into this." Jason plucked the paper from her grasp and tossed it into the fireplace. The flames licked hungrily at her photographed face. "This changes nothing. It changes everything. Your reputation." "My reputation," he interrupted, his voice hard, "was built on surviving worse than the gossip of pious old women and bored journalists. Let them talk." He came to her, cupping her face. "The only thing that matters is what happens inside these walls, between you and me." But the outside world had claws. Hateful emails found their way to his business address. A few protesters, stirred up by a firebrand local priest, gathered with signs outside his building, their shouts a faint, ugly chorus from the street below. "Repent, sinner. Save your soul." The ugliness seeped in, a poison that began to taint their sanctuary. Aria started jumping at the phone. She avoided the windows. The guilt she thought she had conquered came creeping back, a familiar, toxic fog. What if they were right? What if she had traded her soul for a fleeting pleasure? One night, after a particularly vile piece of mail arrived, a photoshopped image of her in her habit, burning in hellfire, she broke. She packed her small bag, her hands shaking. She was a poison in his life, a scandal. He was a strong man, but no one was strong enough to withstand this forever. Leaving was the only act of love she had left to give. She crept into the living room, intending to write him a note. But he was there, sitting in the dark, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "Going somewhere." His voice was quiet, dangerously calm. She froze, the bag dropping from her numb fingers. I have to. You see what I'm doing to you? This, all of this, it's because of me." He set his glass down with a sharp click and stood, moving toward her with the lethal grace of a panther. "Do you think I care about any of that? The emails, the fools on the street." He stopped in front of her, his expression raw, stripped of all its usual control. For the first time, she saw not the powerful tycoon, but the man, a man terrified of losing her. "They are nothing," he snarled, his voice cracking. "Nothing. You are everything. This, what we have in this room, is the only real thing I've ever had." He grabbed her shoulders, his grip almost painful. "Do you understand me, Aria? If you walk out that door, you don't take the scandal with you. You take my goddamn soul." The confession shattered her. He was not an unbreakable fortress. He needed her as desperately as she needed him. Her leaving would not save him, it would destroy him. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at him, at this fierce, beautiful, vulnerable man. All the fight, all the fear drained out of her. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm yours, Jason, however you want me, for as long as you want me." A ragged breath escaped him. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, his face buried in her hair. "Forever," he muttered against her skin. "I want you forever." He lifted her into his arms and carried her back to bed, not with the fierce passion of before, but with a solemn, reverent intensity. That night, he made love to her with a desperate tenderness that felt like a vow, a sealing of their pact against the world. It was slower, deeper, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were memorizing her soul. Afterward, wrapped in his arms, Aria knew a final, absolute peace. The voices outside were silenced. The shame was dead. She had faced the fire, and she had not been consumed. She had been forged. She was his, and he was hers, and it was the only faith she would ever need again. The scandal, having failed to break them, began to recede like a tide, leaving behind a stronger, more resilient bond. Jason's ruthless legal team had silenced the most vocal outlets, and the protesters, finding no satisfying drama, eventually dispersed. The silence that returned to their lives was different from the monasteries. It was warm, earned, and filled with the unspoken language of two people who had chosen each other against the world. But peace, Aria was learning, did not mean the past was erased. It simply lurked in the shadows of a man's eyes. She began to notice the ghosts that haunted him. The way he would sometimes stare into the middle distance, his jaw tight, his gaze centuries old. The faint, silvery scars that mapped a history of violence across his knuckles and back, scars she now traced with her lips in the dark. A silent question. One evening, they were in his study. He was going over documents, and she was curled on a leather sofa, reading. Her eyes fell on a small, framed photograph tucked away on a high shelf. It was of a younger Jason, his smile easier, his arm around a beautiful woman with a radiant smile. A small boy, no more than 5, with Jason's eyes, was perched on his shoulders. Her heart stuttered. She hadn't known. He had never spoken of them. He must have felt her gaze. He looked up, his eyes following hers to the photograph. The air in the room went still. For a long moment, he just looked at the picture, his face an impenetrable mask of stone. Her name was Isabella, he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. It was the first time he had voluntarily offered a piece of his history. My son was Matteo. Aria held her breath, afraid any movement would shatter the moment. A car accident, he continued, his tone flat, devoid of emotion, which told her everything about the depth of the pain. A drunk driver, 6 years ago. The pieces clicked into place, the controlled rage, the cynicism, the walls that had taken her so long to scale. He hadn't just been a wealthy, solitary man. He had been a king whose entire kingdom had been wiped out in a single, brutal moment. Jason, she breathed, her heart aching for him. He finally looked at her, and the raw, unvarnished grief in his eyes was more devastating than any anger. I built everything you see after that. The money, the power, it was all just a fortress, a way to drown out the silence. His gaze swept over her, taking in her tear-filled eyes, her open expression. Until a lost nun showed up at my gates and made a hell of a lot of noise. He rose and came to her, kneeling before the sofa so their eyes were level. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm. "You asked me once why I helped you that day in the alley," he said. "I saw the loss in your eyes. It was a reflection of my own. But yours hadn't yet turned to stone. I think I wanted to see if I could still save something, if I could still feel something." Aria brought his hand to her lips, kissing his scarred knuckles. "You saved me, Jason. In every way a person can be saved." A slow, genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and banished the ghosts, finally touched his lips. "No, Aria, we saved each other." He pulled her into his lap on the floor, holding her tightly, his face buried in her neck. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people whose jagged edges fit together perfectly, making each other whole. The last barrier between them had fallen. There were no more secrets, no more pasts to hide. There was only the present and the future they would build together. Weeks turned into months. Aria's world, once defined by stone walls and rigid schedules, was now a vibrant tapestry of new experiences. Jason taught her to dance in the living room to music that had no religious purpose, only the purpose of joy. She learned to cook, creating meals that were a celebration of taste and sensation, a far cry from the simple, utilitarian food of the monastery. Her body was no longer a source of conflict, but a playground of discovery. Jason's admiration was a constant healing balm. He would watch her dress, his eyes hot with appreciation, and tell her how the curve of her hip was a masterpiece, how the softness of her belly was a comfort he'd never known he needed. Under his worship, the last traces of her shame melted away, replaced by a proud, powerful femininity. One Sunday morning, instead of the silence of the chapel, she found herself in a sun-drenched art studio Jason had secretly arranged for her. Canvases, paints, and brushes surrounded her. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, she began to paint. She didn't paint saints or crosses. She painted the curve of a shoulder, the arch of a back, the interplay of light and shadow on skin. She painted feeling. When Jason came to see what she had created, he stood in silence for a long time before a particular piece, an abstract swirl of crimson and gold, fierce and passionate. "It's us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, coming to stand beside him. "It's my new prayer. It's called gratitude. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her. A deep, soul-searing kiss that held the weight of all their shared history, the pain, the loss, the scandal, and the glorious, hard-won redemption. That evening, they hosted a small dinner party, a few of his trusted business associates and their partners. Aria, in a dress of deep blue that made her feel like a queen, was no longer the timid, lost nun. She was his equal, her wit sharp, her laughter easy, her grace innate. She saw the way people looked at them not with judgment, but with respect, and even a touch of envy at the obvious, powerful connection that thrummed between them. Later, as the last guest left, Jason pulled her onto the balcony, overlooking the glittering city. He held her from behind, his arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on her head. "I have something for you," he said softly. He turned her around. In his hand was not a ring, but a simple, old key on a delicate silver chain. "It's the key to the first apartment I bought after I lost them," he said. "It was my refuge, my cave. No one else has ever had it." He fastened the chain around her neck. The key rested just above the swell of her breasts, a cool, heavy weight against her skin. "It doesn't lock anything anymore, but it unlocks me. It's a reminder that my heart, my past, my whole world, it's all yours to keep. Always." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy filled Aria's eyes. This was more profound than any vow of celibacy, any promise to a distant deity. This was a vow between two souls, forged in fire and sealed with an unbreakable trust. She looked out at the endless lights of the city, no longer a terrifying wilderness, but a landscape of infinite possibilities. She was not a fallen woman. She was a risen one. She had traded the echo of prayer for the sound of her own laughter, the cold stone floor for the warmth of a man's embrace, the fear of desire for its glorious, passionate embrace. She had found a faith not in denying the world, but in embracing it. A faith not in a wrathful God, but in the divine, redeeming power of a love that was fierce, real, and utterly, completely theirs. Leaning back against Jason's strong, steady frame, the key a sacred weight over her heart, Sister Aria was finally, truly free. And so, Aria and Jason found a faith not in silence, but in the whispers they shared in the dark. A love that was worth every scandal and every step into the unknown. If their journey touched your heart, then this is my own whisper to you, dear listener. Let me know what you thought. Did you ache for Aria's conflict? Were you captivated by Jason's fierce devotion? Leave a comment and tell me which character's journey resonated with you the most. I read every single one, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. It's a joy to know how far these stories of love and redemption can travel. If you're longing for more stories where passion challenges duty and love heals the deepest wounds, then follow the path to Mr. Relationship Stories. Subscribe and let us continue to explore the darkest secrets and the brightest devotions of the heart together until the next story finds you.